When you picture a classic landscape painting, maybe like a beautiful pastoral scene with rolling green hills and an old barn, there are usually cows somewhere in the frame.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Usually just grazing.
Right. They're almost always just background scenery, like these quiet blobs of black and white or brown, chewing grass, adding a little rustic texture to the image.
Yeah, we'd expect them to be part of the canvas, just completely passive and simple.
Exactly. Until you realize that the quiet blob of black and white in the background is currently detecting the Earth's magnetic field, actively holding a grudge against the cow standing next to it, and physiologically reacting to the emotional state of the farmer walking toward it.
It's wild.
Yeah.
And the material we are diving into today completely upends that expectation. I mean, it
Yeah.
forces us to take an animal we take entirely for granted and examine it through, well, three distinct and frankly completely different frameworks.
Right, which is the mission of this deep dive. We are going to look at them through rigorous modern science, the anecdotal accounts of interspecies communicators, and the teachings of spiritual wisdom.
And, looking at something as ubiquitous as a cow from such drastically different vantage points, it gives us a much more dimensional understanding of how humanity interacts with the natural world. It's totally fine to be skeptical, but looking at all three lenses is just fascinating.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the science. Because modern science is fundamentally rewriting the story of the cow.
Yeah, it really is.
We are not looking at simple biological machines operating purely on instinct. I mean, we are talking about individuals with robust long-term memories who can distinguish between specific humans and specific animals using nuanced sight and sound.
Right, and to put the mechanics of that into perspective, recognizing individuals means they are constantly processing complex social data.
Like keeping a mental file on everyone they meet.
Basically, yeah. They are not giving a generic, hardwired reaction to the presence of a human. They are reacting specifically to you based on an entire history of past interactions that they've, stored, evaluated, and recalled.
Wow. And I want to get into one specific behavioral detail here that really shifts how you view their intelligence. Because scientists set up studies where cows were given complex puzzles to solve.
Oh, the puzzle studies. Those are incredible.
Right. For instance, having to figure out a multi-step gate mechanism to reach a food reward. And when they finally crack the code, they don't just amble over and eat. They visibly celebrate.
Yes.
They run, they kick their legs in the air, they show undeniable signs of excitement.
It is a profound neurological response to their own agency. I mean, they realize they have successfully manipulated their physical environment, and they experience an observable dopamine rush because of it.
It totally reminds me of finally fixing a frustrating tech issue. Like getting a stubborn Wi-Fi router to connect after an hour of troubleshooting. When that little green light finally comes on, you do a little fist pump. Oh, for sure. You feel that rush of victory.
But if I think about this critically, am I just projecting here? Is equating a cow kicking its legs to a human celebrating a router fix just us anthropomorphizing an animal?
Well, it is a vital question to ask, but your Wi-Fi router analogy actually falls a bit short of what the cow is experiencing.
Wait, really? How so?
Because a cow's eureka moment is fundamentally different. It's rooted in basic survival agency. It's not just problem solving for convenience, it's the neurological realization of control over their physical world. And what's fascinating here is that the science supports that this is a genuine emotional state, not human projection.
Okay.
It comes down to a measurable psychological concept called cognitive bias.
Right. Okay, explain how cognitive bias actually functions in a cow's brain.
So think of cognitive bias like wearing a pair of tinted glasses. The color of the lenses dictates how you perceive the world around you. If a cow is experiencing chronic stress from rough handling, they are wearing dark, pessimistic glasses.
Meaning everything looks like a threat. Exactly. They will interpret a completely ambiguous situation, say a sudden shadow in the barn or an unfamiliar bucket, as a direct threat. They assume the worst.
Oh, wow. So they just default to fear.
They do. Conversely, if a cow is in a state of contentment, perhaps frequently experiencing those positive eureka moments of agency we just discussed, well, they're wearing optimistic glasses.
So they see that same shadow and react differently.
Precisely. They approach that exact same ambiguous shadow or bucket with curiosity rather than fear. The underlying emotional baseline literally alters their reality.
Man, so their emotional processing acts as a filter for their physical environment, but their physical sensory perception is on an entirely different level to begin with.
Oh, absolutely.
Like they have nearly 360-degree vision, meaning their visual data intake is massive compared to ours. They are incredibly sensitive to microscopic visual changes in their surroundings. And then there's the magnetic alignment. Studies suggest cows can actually detect the Earth's magnetic field.
Yes, the observational data shows they often naturally align their bodies north to south when they are grazing or resting in a pasture.
But how does a large mammal actually feel a magnetic field? Like, do they have a compass in their brain?
Well, the exact biological mechanism for magnetoreception in large mammals is still a subject of intense scientific inquiry, but we know how it functions in other animals.
Like birds and things.
Right. Some theories point to microscopic magnetic particles, like magnetite, embedded in specific cells that physically react to magnetic poles.
Oh, that's wild.
Or other theories point to specialized light-sensitive proteins in the eyes called cryptochromes. That might actually allow an animal to literally see or sense magnetic lines as a visual overlay.
Wait, they might be able to actually see the magnetic field?
It's possible. The functional result, regardless of the precise cellular mechanism, is that they are plugged into a planetary frequency. They are constantly orienting themselves based on invisible geological forces.
Imagine if you could intuitively feel the magnetic pull of the planet pulling on you while you were just like standing in line at the grocery store.
It would be overwhelming for us.
Yeah, it really forces you to realize that if you stand in a pasture right now, the animal looking back at you is experiencing a version of physical reality that is completely invisible to human senses.
And that physical sensitivity, that ability to detect unseen magnetic fields and microscopic visual changes, it provides a crucial context for their social behavior.
How so?
Because an animal that is biologically wired to be that highly attuned to its physical environment is equally, if not more, attuned to the emotional environment of its herd.
Ah, right. And the research absolutely bears that out. Cows maintain incredibly complex social networks. I mean, they have preferred companions, essentially best friends, whom they actively choose to spend time with, groom, and graze next to.
They really do have best friends.
And conversely, they hold grudges. Or at least they actively avoid certain individuals they have had negative encounters with in the past.
Right, because the herd is not just a random collection of bodies standing in a field. It is a highly structured, emotionally regulated community. They synchronize their eating, their resting, and their movements.
Like a coordinated dance.
Exactly. That synchronization is a well-documented survival mechanism to protect against predators, sure. But executing it requires a constant, silent dialogue of observation and empathy. They are continuously taking the emotional temperature of the individuals around them to maintain that unified front.
Which makes human interaction with them incredibly high stakes. I mean, the data shows that gentle handling creates a calm baseline across the herd, but rough treatment creates deep, long-term fear memories that spread.
They really spread. One scared cow can affect the whole group.
Yeah, and nowhere is that emotional depth more measurable than in the mother-calf bond. This isn't just a casual, instinctual pairing that fades after a few days. They recognize each other specifically through unique vocalizations and olfactory cues. They know their specific voice and smell among hundreds of others.
And to understand the depth of that bond, you only have to look at the biological data of what happens when it is broken.
It's pretty heartbreaking, right?
It is. When a mother and calf are separated, it doesn't just result in a passive display of sadness. Both the mother and the calf experience deeply measurable physiological distress.
Like actual biological changes.
Exactly. Their cortisol levels, the stress hormone, they spike dramatically. Their heart rates elevate. Their vocalizations increase in both frequency and volume, and they engage in frantic, active searching behaviors.
So it's basically a full-blown physiological panic response.
It is. The biological evidence proves beyond any doubt that cows are deeply, fundamentally connected to the emotional states of those around them. They absorb the energy of their environment.
Wow.
And understanding that scientifically proven hypersensitive emotional radar is vital when we look at how other groups of people attempt to interact with these animals.
Right, because science tells us they have this hypersensitive radar, but what happens when humans try to tap directly into it?
That is where it gets interesting.
Yeah, that brings us to a much more controversial space. The source material delves into the anecdotal accounts of interspecies communicators, practitioners like Penelope Smith, Anna Breitenbach, and Marta Williams. Now, We need to be incredibly clear with you listening.
Yes, very clear.
We are simply reporting the framework presented in our source material. We aren't endorsing telepathy as scientific fact, nor are we debunking it. Our goal is to examine the mechanics they describe, because they are fascinating when placed next to the biology we just covered.
The primary question is how these practitioners claim to actually achieve this communication. It is not portrayed as a literal conversation with words.
Right, they aren't claiming that cows are speaking English sentences into their minds like a cartoon. The mechanics, according to these communicators, operate through a nonverbal transference of images, emotions, and physical sensations.
Sensations like what, exactly?
Well, for example, a practitioner might suddenly experience a sharp physical tightness in their own chest, which they translate as the animal experiencing stress or anxiety. Or they might receive a sudden, clear mental image of a water trough, indicating the animal is thirsty.
Essentially, they are describing a deliberate empathetic transference. The human communicator is attempting to act as a biological receiver for the animal's internal sensory experience.
Oh, I like that term, biological receiver.
Yeah, they are tuning their own nervous system to pick up on the emotional broadcast of the cow.
And sometimes it's just a general radiating sensation. A feeling of profound warmth might translate to the cow experiencing comfort and safety. Across the board, regardless of their specific methods, these telepathic communicators describe cows as being naturally grounded, deeply sensitive to the emotional states of humans and other animals, and profoundly traumatized by separation.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, here is where the overlap between these two very different paradigms gets incredibly compelling.
The science and the telepathy.
Yes. These interspecies communicators claim that cows exist in a sort of shared emotional field. They describe a scenario where the stress of one single animal ripples out invisibly and affects the entire herd on a telepathic level.
But wait, even if you are entirely skeptical of a supernatural telepathic mechanism, that description perfectly mirrors the hard scientific data we just discussed.
Exactly.
Science objectively shows that the stress of one cow measurably elevates the cortisol levels and stress markers in the cows standing nearby.
That is the crucial connection. The scientific mechanism relies on subtle visual and auditory cues. A slight change in posture, the widening of an eye, or a shift in vocal pitch that triggers a hormonal response in the herd.
Right.
The interspecies communicators mechanism relies on the concept of an invisible, metaphysical emotional field. Yet the end result being described by both groups is identical. The cow is a hyper-empathetic sponge for its environment. The language differs entirely, but the observation of the animal's fundamental nature is exactly the same.
That shared observation, this profound, almost fragile sensitivity, it leads directly into how certain spiritual traditions interpret the existence of the cow. Because both the scientists and the telepaths agree on the sensitivity, which brings us to the teachings of Supreme Master Ching Hai.
And this is the third lens.
Right. In her spiritual framework, animals are not lesser, primitive biological machines. They are souls with distinct, quantifiable levels of spiritual development. And again, just to maintain our strict neutrality here, we are exploring this as a theological structure presented in the text, not presenting it as absolute dogma.
Right, it functions as a system of classification. But instead of measuring heart rate, cortisol, or cognitive bias, it is attempting to measure spiritual resonance.
Yeah. And her system specifically breaks down spiritual development into 4 distinct metrics. You have positive quality, or PQ, which represents uplifting, constructive energy. Negative quality, EQ, represents harmful, destructive, or heavy energy. Then there is saintly quality, SQ, representing inner purity and spiritual elevation. And finally, goodness quality, GQ, which focuses on outward kindness and benevolence.
But a framework like that requires a way to actually quantify those abstract concepts to make them useful, right?
And she does exactly that. She gives cows a literal percentage breakdown.
We're good.
Yeah. According to her teachings, cows possess 38% positive quality, 0% negative quality, 40% saintly quality, and 50% goodness quality. It is a highly specific grading rubric for a soul.
That is so specific. And, if you analyze those numbers, the most glaring statistic in that breakdown is the 0% negative quality.
0%, literally no capacity for harm.
Yeah. To understand the philosophical reasoning behind that 0%, you have to look at the cow's functional existence in the world. In this theological framework, malice requires intent.
Right. They aren't out there plotting anything.
Exactly. A cow's entire biological and social structure is based on grazing, herd synchronization, and the avoidance of predators. They do not hunt, they do not plot, They do not seek to dominate other species for support or power.
Hmm.
Therefore, within this spiritual logic, they are categorized as fundamentally incapable of generating negative, harmful energy. They are functionally nonviolent beings.
Which makes sense. And you mentioned the difference between saintly quality and goodness quality earlier. How does this framework separate the two when looking at a cow?
Well, saintly quality, or ACQ, generally refers to an internal state of being, natural purity or closeness to the divine. So the 40% Q reflects their peaceful, contemplative nature.
And the goodness quality.
Goodness quality, or GQ, which is at 50%, reflects outward benevolent action. In the context of a cow, this represents their historical role as providers, giving milk, tilling land, and sustaining human communities for millennia without demanding anything in return.
I kind of look at it like looking at a character's stat sheet in a role-playing game. It's wild. But this specific combination of percentages places them near what she calls the fifth level of spiritual consciousness, which is an incredibly elevated, advanced state.
It really is an exalted position.
It completely reframes their docility. I mean, we look at a cow standing quietly in a field, and the default human assumption is often, oh, they're slow, they're simple, they're just staring blankly. But the spiritual framework suggests they are quiet because they are at peace. They are highly evolved souls resting in a state of grace.
Under this view, they transcend the category of livestock entirely. They are not resources waiting to be utilized or commodities to be traded. As the material quotes, they are our friends, our helpers, and heaven's beloved.
So what does this all mean? We have laid out three wildly divergent paradigms for you today.
Very divergent.
Right. We have the rigorous, data-driven world of behavioral science and magnetoreception. We have the intuitive, sensation-based world of interspecies communication and emotional transference. And we have the structured, metaphysical world of spiritual teachings and soul metrics.
It's a lot to process.
How are you supposed to reconcile all of that in your head the next time you drive past a dairy farm?
I think the reconciliation happens when you look at the underlying thesis connecting all three of these frameworks.
Which is?
Well, the biologists prove with measurable data that these animals think, feel, remember, and bond. The interspecies communicators assert that they intuitively sense, connect, and respond to the deepest emotional frequencies around them. And the spiritual teachers revere them as pure, elevated souls incapable of malice. We're looking at three completely different languages: biology, intuition, and theology. Yet they're all pointing toward the exact same realization.
A creature of immense depth hiding in plain sight.
Yes, a creature experiencing a rich, complex reality that we routinely ignore because it is inconvenient or simply because we haven't been taught how to look at them.
And that brings us to the ultimate challenge presented by the source material. Because once you absorb the science of their memories, the mechanics of their empathy, and the philosophy of their peacefulness, the central question shifts.
It shifts completely.
The question is no longer, what are cows? We have answered that. The real question becomes, how do we choose to see them?
Do we continue to see them merely as objects in a landscape, or do we acknowledge them as active, experiencing lives?
Do we keep them as background scenery, or do we recognize them as complex beings? The material states so beautifully at the end that sometimes seeing clearly is where compassion begins. You cannot empathize with a blob of paint on a canvas. You can only empathize when you realize you are looking at a living subject with its own internal world, its own fears, and its own quiet victories.
Which is exactly why taking the time to look at a singular subject through multiple, even conflicting frameworks is so crucial. It prevents us from getting trapped in a single echo chamber of information. It forces us to synthesize facts, anecdotes, and philosophy to find the broader, more dimensional truth of a subject's existence.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Our goal is always to help you filter through the noise, understand the mechanisms behind the facts, and find those moments of insight that fundamentally change how you interact with the world around you.
And this raises an important question, a final thought I want to leave you with. We spent this entire time talking about an animal most of us only ever see from a distance grazing silently by the highway.
Right.
And we've learned that this animal can physically feel the Earth's magnetic forces pulling on its body. It is so emotionally attuned that a single spike of fear in one animal can ripple invisibly through an entire herd.
Which is still blowing my mind.
If that level of silent, complex communication is happening right now in a random pasture, what other invisible forces and emotional dialogues are the animals in our own homes experiencing?
Oh, wow.
What is your dog or your cat sensing in your physiology or in the energy of your living room that we, and all of our supposed human intelligence, are completely oblivious to.
That is quite the thought to chew on. It makes you realize that just because we can't hear the conversation doesn't mean the world isn't talking. So the next time you look at that landscape painting or you drive past that green field, don't just look at the background scenery. Look at the gentle geniuses looking back at you. Keep questioning, keep unpacking, and stay curious.